Have you ever wondered how a young woman, born on a struggling Caribbean plantation thousands of kilometers from Paris, became the most powerful woman in Europe? How did a woman imprisoned during one of history's bloodiest revolutions survive when tens of thousands around her were sent to the guillotine? And perhaps, most intriguingly of all, why did one of history's greatest military leaders, a man who conquered much of Europe, remain emotionally attached to this woman for the rest of his life? Today, we're exploring the extraordinary story of Josephine Bonaparte, the woman who would become Empress of the French, wife of Napoleon, survivor of revolution, trendsetter, patron of the arts, and one of history's most fascinating figures. Was it love? Was it ambition? Was it simply politics? Stay with me. Josephine's life contains all the ingredients of an unforgettable story: wealth and poverty, revolution and terror, romance and betrayal, and power and survival. And as always, while we explore this fascinating period of history, we'll also improve your English naturally through vocabulary, grammar, idioms, and expressions used by native speakers today. So welcome to Listen Global English. I'm Gary, I'm British, but I've lived and taught in Colombia since 2010. And over the last 16 years, I've taught English to professionals, to companies and individuals across Colombia, South America, and around the world. The idea behind this podcast is very simple. Instead of memorizing endless lists of vocabulary, we learn English through genuinely interesting global stories, through history and current affairs. For example, if I say that Josephine eventually rose to prominence, this expression, to rise to prominence, means to become famous, important, or influential. Today, you will hear many technology companies have risen to prominence over the last 20 years. Or perhaps, we might say Josephine's family was constantly trying to get by financially. To get by is a phrasal verb, meaning to survive or manage with limited resources. During university, I didn't earn much money, but somehow I managed to get by. So let's begin our story. Josephine Bonaparte was not born Josephine at all. She entered the world on the 23rd of June, 1763, as Marie-Joseph Rose Tacher de la Pagerie. We believe on the Caribbean island of Martinique. Martinique was a French colony, part of what Europeans at the time called the West Indies. A colony is just a territory controlled politically and economically by another country. For example, India was once a British colony. Many Caribbean islands were European colonies during the 18th century. We often use the passive voice here. Passive structures are extremely common when discussing history, because often we are more interested in the event itself than in the person carrying out the action. For example, the island was colonized in the 17th century, rather than say France colonized the island. Both are correct, but historians frequently prefer the passive voice. Anyway, Josephine's family owned a sugar plantation. We say that appearances can be deceptive. This means things are not always what they seem. At first glance, the Tacher family, they looked wealthy and aristocratic. But in reality, they were frequently struggling financially. That expression at first glance just means when seen or considered for the first time. You might hear, at first glance, the house looked perfect, but there were many hidden problems. Josephine's grandfather had emigrated from France decades earlier and established the family plantation. The family possessed social connections, but not necessarily great wealth. And this difference between appearing wealthy and actually being wealthy would influence Josephine's entire life. She would spend much of her life trying to secure financial stability. Now, we cannot discuss Josephine's childhood honestly without addressing a difficult subject. The prosperity of Caribbean plantations depended on enslaved Africans. Martinique, like many Caribbean islands, became a major producer of sugar, and this production relied on slave labor. When you hear the word enslaved, modern historians increasingly prefer this term, enslaved people, rather than slaves, because the word slave can reduce people to a condition, whereas enslaved person reminds us that these were human beings who had freedom taken away from them. Language evolves. As English learners, it's important to understand not only vocabulary, but also changing cultural perspectives. Josephine herself was mainly raised by an enslaved woman named Marion. Marion cared for Josephine during childhood and called her simply Rose. In fact, the name Josephine only appeared much later in her life, when Napoleon later began calling her Josephine. Historians tell us that the name stuck. If something sticks, it continues or remains. The nickname stuck for the rest of his life, for instance, or you could say the idea never really stuck with the public. Josephine's early years were far from secure. The family's finances were constantly under pressure. The global expansion of sugar production had reduced prices dramatically. More sugar was being produced, so plantation owners earned less money. This is basic economics. When supply increases dramatically, prices often fall. You could describe her situation as precarious. Precarious means uncertain, or insecure, or dangerous, because the future is not guaranteed. As an example, many workers today have precarious employment. Or you might hear, after losing his job, his financial situation became precarious. So back to the story. Josephine's family were not poor, but they often lived from hand to mouth. That's an idiom. It means having just enough money to survive, with nothing left over. During economic crises, many families live from hand to mouth. For instance, fortunately, the family still possessed enough money to send Josephine to a boarding school run by Benedictine nuns. There she learned reading, writing, dancing, and embroidery. All things that were expected of upper-class women during the 18th century. Now we arrive at one of the most surprising aspects of 18th century society. Marriage among wealthy families was often less about love and more about economics. Josephine's family desperately needed money. An opportunity emerged through connections with the wealthy Beauharnais family. Initially, Josephine's younger sister Catherine was supposed to marry Alexandre de Beauharnais. But tragedy intervened. Catherine died. And suddenly, attention turned to Josephine. And in 1779, she was 16 years old, she sailed to France to marry Alexandra. To turn to someone or something means to direct attention towards someone, or maybe to seek help from them. After Catherine died, the family turned to Josephine. You might hear today when he was struggling financially, he turned to his parents for help. So imagine what this must have felt like. A 16-year-old girl leaving a tropical Caribbean island to travel across the Atlantic Ocean to marry a man she barely knew. No phones, no internet, no easy communication. Once she sailed away, she was effectively leaving everything familiar behind. Josephine arrived in France completely unprepared for elite Parisian society. Although she had received an education, many French aristocrats regarded her as provincial and unsophisticated. Provincial can describe someone perceived as lacking sophistication because they come from outside major cultural centers. It's often used negatively. Some Parisians considered people from rural areas provincial, for example. However, Josephine possessed one remarkable quality: adaptability, the ability to adjust successfully to new situations. In modern English, employers frequently value adaptability. You might hear, "We are looking for candidates who demonstrate adaptability and resilience." One famous example of Josephine's adaptability involved her appearance. Because she had grown up surrounded by sugar and lacked modern dental care, her teeth were badly damaged. Historians describe them as black and rotten. But rather than allowing this to destroy her social prospects, Josephine simply learned to smile without showing her teeth. This tells us something important about her personality. She was practical, resourceful, and extraordinarily resilient. Resilient means able to recover quickly from difficulties. For example, despite numerous setbacks, she remained resilient. Unfortunately, Josephine's marriage proved deeply unhappy. Alexandre de Beauharnais was abusive. Historians recalled numerous physical attacks, and he was repeatedly unfaithful. Despite these difficulties, Josephine gave birth to 2 children. When discussing complicated historical timelines, historians frequently use the past perfect. To give you an example of this, by the time Josephine left her husband, he had already taken several mistresses. Notice "had taken." This is past perfect. We use it to describe an action completed before another past action. You could say by the age of 22, Josephine had become the mother of 2 children. Past perfect. Okay, back to the story. Eventually, Josephine left Alexander and sought refuge in a convent. To seek refuge means to go somewhere safe for protection. You might hear many civilians sought refuge during the war. However, Alexandra forced her to return by taking their son. Eventually they separated unofficially, although they never formally divorced. Josephine increasingly built her own social network and romantic relationships. In many ways, she was trying to make the best of a bad situation. This expression means to deal with a difficult circumstance as positively as possible, to make the best of a bad situation. And then, just as Josephine was rebuilding her life, history intervened. France was about to explode. The late 1780s were a period of crisis. Poor harvests, financial mismanagement, government debt, and social inequality. All of these factors pushed France towards revolution. In 1789, King Louis XVI, he summoned the Estates General for the first time in 175 years. He sort of recognized the crisis. But events quickly spiraled out of control. That means they became increasingly uncontrollable. The political crisis spiraled out of control. Soon, revolutionaries stormed the Bastille prison. That's an event often regarded as the symbolic beginning of the French Revolution. The old social order was collapsing. Surprisingly, at first, Josephine's husband thrived. That means he did well. He thrived. Alexandre embraced the revolution. And he even renounced many aristocratic privileges. He rejected them. For a while, the Beauharnais family, they prospered. They did well. But we say that revolutions have a tendency to devour, to eat their own supporters. The next part of this story is all about discovering how Josephine went from privileged aristocrat to prisoner awaiting possible execution during the terrifying period known as the Reign of Terror. You'll hear how a widowed survivor of revolution would eventually meet an ambitious young Corsican officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. And history would never be the same again. So Josephine was living at a time of enormous uncertainty. France was in the middle of a revolution. The old aristocratic order was collapsing. And Josephine's husband, as we said, he had initially prospered, done well, under the new revolutionary government. But as is often the case with revolutions, events were about to take what we call a darker turn, get worse. So this becomes one of the most terrifying periods in modern European history, the Reign of Terror. Josephine survived imprisonment, she escaped almost certain death, and she met the man who would change her life forever, Napoleon Bonaparte. There's an old saying, it's an idiom: revolutions devour their own children. This expression means that many revolutions eventually destroy or persecute the very people who originally supported them. And this is exactly what happened in France. At first, Alexandre de Beauharnais, he embraced the revolution enthusiastically. He supported reforms, he renounced aristocratic privileges, and he rose rapidly within the revolutionary government. He even served as president of the National Constituent Assembly for a time. But circumstances changed dramatically. In 1791, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette attempted to flee France. They hoped to escape to Austrian territory and seek protection there. Unfortunately for them, they were recognized, they were captured, and brought back to Paris. And this event destroyed much of the public's trust in the monarchy. When I say to flee means to run away from danger, or persecution, or an unpleasant situation. thousands of civilians fled the war zone, for instance, or the king attempted to flee the country. So as an example, you could say by the time revolutionary soldiers arrived, many aristocrats had already fled. This sentence uses the past perfect again, had fled, because the fleeing happened before the soldiers arrived. By the time revolutionary soldiers arrived, many aristocrats had already fled. Now, as distrust increased, political opinions became increasingly extreme. The revolution became more radical. A radical person supports very significant social or political change. You could say, for instance, the radical revolutionaries demanded the complete abolition of the monarchy. Eventually, King Louis XVI was executed in January 1793. Queen Marie Antoinette, she followed several months later. So the monarchy disappeared. France became a republic. But the new republic immediately faced enemies on all sides: Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Several European monarchies feared revolutionary ideas spreading across Europe, and therefore they declared war on France. To face up to something means to accept and deal with a difficult reality, and the revolutionary government had to face up to the possibility of invasion. As an example, you might hear today, many countries today must face up to climate change. In times of crisis, fear often increases, and fear can lead to paranoia. Paranoia is an unreasonable or excessive fear that other people are trying to harm or betray you. During the years 1793 and 1794, revolutionary leaders became increasingly suspicious, increasingly paranoid. Anyone could become an enemy, even loyal revolutionaries. The radical Jacobins, led by figures such as Maximilien Robespierre, they created a government called the Committee for Public Safety. Its purpose was simple: identify enemies, arrest them, execute them. And historians estimate that tens of thousands of people died during this period. If you live in fear, you constantly feel afraid. To live in fear. Many French citizens lived in fear during the Reign of Terror. Even Alexandre de Beauharnais, Josephine's husband, despite his revolutionary credentials, he became suspect. Why? Well, firstly, he came from an aristocratic family. Secondly, he had been associated with a military defeat in Germany. And these factors proved disastrous. He was arrested in March 1794. Even after years of unhappiness in their marriage, Josephine courageously attempted to save Alexandre. She petitioned the revolutionary authorities for his release, but instead she was arrested herself. To petition just means to make a formal request to an authority. As an example, you might hear citizens petition the government for political reform. So Josephine was imprisoned in Paris. Conditions within the prison were horrific. The prison had witnessed massacres, food was scarce, sanitation was virtually non-existent. Prisoners received minimal rations and had extremely limited access to basic necessities. Scarce just means in short supply, not abundant. You might hear food became scarce during the war, or fresh water is scarce in some regions. So imagine Josephine's situation. She was a woman born into relative privilege. She was used to salons, social gatherings, and fashionable clothing. Now imprisoned, waiting, not knowing whether each day might be her last. Alexandra, he eventually received what historians describe as a perfunctory trial. Perfunctory means done quickly and without genuine care or attention. A perfunctory trial is not a fair trial. It's simply a formality. Alexandra was found guilty and executed by guillotine in July 1794. And Josephine almost certainly expected to suffer the same fate. She was staring death in the face. This means to confront death directly. Josephine stared death in the face while imprisoned. Again, history intervened. Just 4 days after her husband's execution, Robespierre himself was arrested, and the Reign of Terror collapsed. Robespierre was executed, and a new period began. It was known as the Thermidorian reaction, but it was a new period in history. And Josephine was released shortly afterwards. Many modern historians believe that Josephine may have suffered from what today we call post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. After all, she had experienced imprisonment, constant fear, the execution of her husband, social collapse, and uncertainty regarding her children's future. Yet once again, Josephine demonstrated extraordinary resilience. She bounced back. To bounce back means to recover successfully after difficulties. For example, Josephine managed to bounce back after her imprisonment. You'll hear today the company bounced back after the economic crisis. As a widow, Josephine began rebuilding her social network. She formed relationships with several influential men, including General Lazare Hoche and the politician Paul Barras. And this was no accident. Josephine understood something extremely important. In unstable times, powerful connections could mean survival. And now we arrive at one of history's most famous meetings. In late 1795, Josephine encountered a rising military officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. Encountered just means met or found. Napoleon was 6 years younger than Josephine. He came from Corsica. He was ambitious, brilliant, and he was intense. And he was not particularly sophisticated socially. However, he had recently become a national hero. Earlier that year, Napoleon had successfully suppressed a royalist uprising in Paris. And as a result, his political prospects looked extremely promising. Prospects just means future possibilities or chances of success. You might hear his career prospects improved significantly, or today economic prospects remain uncertain. Now, interestingly, Josephine may have engineered their meeting. She may have arranged it. According to historical accounts, her son visited Napoleon, seeking assistance in recovering his deceased father's sword. Shortly afterwards, Josephine and Napoleon met in person. Whether this was coincidence or careful planning remains unclear. To pull strings means to use influence or personal connections to obtain something. Some historians believe Josephine pulled strings to arrange the meeting. Napoleon fell in love almost immediately. We should really say he became obsessed. He began writing passionate letters to Josephine, declaring his profound, his deep love. Josephine, however, was less enthusiastic, at least initially, at first. Napoleon is referred to as instantly smitten. To be smitten means to be strongly attracted to or deeply in love with someone. He was completely smitten from their very first meeting. Now, many historians argue that Josephine viewed Napoleon pragmatically. She needed security. Napoleon offered wealth, status, and political influence and protection. At the time, Josephine was still interested in General Hoche and may have preferred him had circumstances been different. Now, historical discussions frequently use what we call the third conditional. If Hoche had left his wife, for example, Josephine might have married him instead. The structure here, the grammatical structure, is if plus past perfect plus would or might have and a past participle. This structure describes hypothetical past situations. To give you another example of this conditional, the third conditional, if Robespierre had remained in power, Josephine would almost certainly have died. That's the third conditional. So back to the story. Despite their differences, Napoleon and Josephine complemented one another remarkably well. There's a famous saying, opposites attract. This means people with different personalities often form successful relationships. Napoleon was energetic, impatient, and often socially awkward. Josephine was elegant. She was charming and socially experienced. She moved comfortably within elite Parisian society. Napoleon did not. Josephine could introduce him to influential circles and help improve his public image. Sophisticated just means experienced or cultured and socially refined. Josephine had become a sophisticated woman of Parisian society. By January 1796, Napoleon had proposed marriage, and on the 9th of March 1796, just a few months after meeting, they married in Paris. The wedding itself perfectly reflected their unconventional relationship. Napoleon arrived 2 hours late. Both lied about their ages. Josephine wore a tricolor Republican sash. If something gets off to a rocky start, it means it begins with difficulties. And their marriage got off to a rocky start. And indeed, only 2 days after marrying, Napoleon departed for Italy to command the French army. Neither of them could possibly have imagined what lay ahead. Military glory, political power, affairs, betrayal, and eventually an empire. In the final part of this story, we'll explore Napoleon's rise to supreme power, Josephine's transformation into Empress of the French. We'll talk about their troubled marriage and the painful divorce that changed both their lives forever. So remember, we heard how Josephine survived the horrors of the French Revolution. escaped almost certain execution, and met the ambitious young general, Napoleon Bonaparte. Their relationship began as a whirlwind romance. Napoleon was completely devoted to her. Josephine, perhaps initially motivated more by practicality than passion, she accepted his proposal. But their marriage would soon face enormous challenges. Josephine eventually became Empress of the French, but her marriage eventually collapsed. Despite everything, Napoleon apparently spoke her name with his final breath. So no sooner had Napoleon and Josephine married than they separated physically. Napoleon departed for Italy 2 days after the wedding to take command of the French army. The campaign transformed him into one of Europe's most celebrated military leaders. Victory followed victory. His reputation soared. To soar just means to rise very quickly or dramatically. Napoleon's popularity soared after his victories in Italy. You can hear today house prices have soared in recent years, for instance. However, while Napoleon was achieving military glory, Josephine remained in Paris. And almost immediately problems emerged. Josephine began an affair with a cavalry officer named Hippolyte Charles. Historians suggest she found him amusing and relaxed and easygoing, qualities Napoleon certainly did not possess. There's a famous saying here, absence makes the heart grow fonder. It means when people are separated, they often love each other more. But in Josephine and Napoleon's case, maybe the opposite occurred. Distance created opportunities for infidelity. Infidelity means being unfaithful in a romantic relationship, infidelity. And to drift apart means to gradually become less emotionally close. As an example, many couples drift apart when they spend long periods separated. Eventually, Josephine traveled to Italy to join Napoleon. Astonishingly, Hippolyte Charles, the guy she was having an affair with, accompanied her, although their relationship was temporarily suspended during the journey. So imagine the situation here. Josephine is traveling to meet her husband. Her lover is traveling with her. Napoleon was completely unaware. History can sometimes resemble fiction. Now, as Napoleon's fortunes improved, Josephine developed increasingly expensive tastes. When we say extravagant, this means spending far more money than necessary. Josephine became famous for her extravagant lifestyle, for example. You'll hear today the wedding was criticized as unnecessarily extravagant. Now, during Napoleon's Italian campaign, Josephine bought jewelry and artworks and luxury goods on an enormous scale. This pattern would actually continue throughout her life. One historian famously remarked that Josephine seemed incapable of controlling her spending. Money burned a hole in her pocket. If money burns a hole in your pocket, you spend it almost immediately. Josephine never managed to save anything because money always seemed to burn a hole in her pocket. After Napoleon's successful return from Italy, the couple moved into an apartment in Paris. Josephine spent approximately 300,000 francs decorating a rented property. Napoleon eventually purchased the same property for 1/6 of that amount, 50,000 francs. When you hear to splash out on something, it means to spend a lot of money on something expensive. Josephine splashed out on mirrors and sculptures and luxurious furnishings. Today you'll hear many people splash out on holidays, vacations, once a year. Her extravagance deeply irritated Napoleon's family. They had never approved of the marriage in the first place. To approve of means to consider something good or acceptable. Napoleon's mother never approved of Josephine. You might hear today, my parents don't approve of smoking. In 1798, Napoleon launched his famous Egyptian campaign. And it was during this expedition that he finally discovered Josephine's affair. He was furious. Initially, he considered divorce. However, after returning to Paris, Josephine and her children pleaded with him, and eventually a reconciliation was achieved. They patched things up. To patch things up means to repair a damaged relationship. For example, after many tears and discussions, Napoleon and Josephine patched things up. Interestingly, historians believe Josephine remained faithful after this point. Napoleon, however, did not. Over the following years, he would engage in numerous affairs. There's a rather old-fashioned idiom here. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Or you might hear what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. It means rules should apply equally to everyone. Napoleon clearly did not follow this principle. He expected fidelity from Josephine, while repeatedly being unfaithful himself. In November of 1799, Napoleon seized power during a coup known as the coup of 18 Brumaire. He became first consul, effectively ruler of France. And Josephine was now the most important woman in the country. Surprisingly, these years appear to have been among the happiest in their marriage. Their personalities complemented each other perfectly. Napoleon worked obsessively. He was a workaholic. And Josephine provided emotional balance. A workaholic is a person who works excessively and compulsively. Napoleon's workaholic nature exhausted many of those around him. And Josephine at this time also became an important political intermediary. People often asked her to speak to Napoleon on their behalf because she possessed exceptional charm and diplomacy and access to Napoleon. An intermediary is a person who acts between two other people. Josephine frequently acted as an intermediary between Napoleon and his ministers, for instance. In December 1800, Napoleon and Josephine narrowly escaped assassination. Counter-revolutionaries, they planted a bomb on a Paris street, hoping to kill them both. A combination of luck, delays, and mistakes prevented disaster. Several innocent people died, but Napoleon and Josephine survived. To have a brush with death, this means to come very close to dying. As an example, Napoleon and Josephine had a brush with death in 1800. One of Josephine's greatest passions was gardening. At her residence, Malmaison, she created one of Europe's most famous rose gardens. She imported rare species from across the world and worked alongside leading botanists and horticultural experts. Horticulture refers to the science and art of growing flowers and fruits and plants. Josephine's influence on gardening was extraordinary. Many historians argue today that she helped popularize roses throughout Europe. To take up is a phrasal verb. It means to begin a hobby or activity. Many aristocrats took up rose cultivation after Josephine made it fashionable to take up. And Josephine also became a major patron of the arts. She supported painters and sculptors, architects and designers. A patron is just someone who financially supports artists or writers or musicians in this case. Josephine was a patron of several important painters, for example. Throughout history, wealthy families often acted as patrons of the arts. In 1804, Napoleon decided to crown himself Emperor of the French. The ceremony at Notre Dame, the cathedral, became one of history's most famous coronations, and Josephine was crowned Empress alongside him. The ceremony was attended by thousands. This is the passive voice. The empire was established in 1804. Passive structures like this allow historians to focus attention on events. Napoleon later famously said, "I win battles, but Josephine wins hearts." She proved enormously popular with ordinary people. Her warmth, generosity, and elegance made her beloved throughout France. She was really well liked, really popular. But unfortunately, beneath the glamour lay a serious problem. Josephine could not give Napoleon an heir. After nearly 10 years together, they had produced no children. And for an emperor, this represented a political crisis. An heir, H-E-I-R, silent H. An heir is a person legally entitled to inherit a title or a property or a position. Napoleon desperately needed a male heir. At first, Napoleon believed he himself might be infertile. However, when one of his mistresses gave birth to a son in 1806, he realized this was not the case, and Josephine's position suddenly became extremely vulnerable. The writing was on the wall. This means there were clear signs that something unpleasant was going to happen. For example, once Napoleon fathered a child elsewhere, the writing was on the wall for Josephine's marriage. By 1809, Napoleon had decided to divorce her. He informed Josephine personally. Her reaction was devastating. Witnesses described screaming, tears, and emotional collapse. Eventually, however, she accepted reality, and the divorce was finalized in 1810. When we say to come to terms with something, this means to gradually accept something painful. For example, Josephine eventually came to terms with the divorce. Napoleon soon married Marie-Louise of Austria, and within a year, she gave birth to a son. So the political objective had been achieved. Yet many historians believe Napoleon never stopped loving Josephine. Following the divorce, Josephine retired, primarily to Malmaison. She devoted herself to gardening, entertaining guests, and supporting the arts. Napoleon continued visiting occasionally, although less frequently as political events consumed his attention. Then disaster struck. Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812. The campaign ended catastrophically. European powers united against him, and by 1814 Napoleon had abdicated and been exiled to the island of Elba. Meanwhile, Josephine's health deteriorated. She developed pneumonia, and she died on the 29th of May, 1814, at the relatively young age of 50. To pass away is a softer, more respectful expression, meaning to die. Josephine passed away in May 1814. Napoleon reportedly took the news extremely badly, isolating himself for several days. And years later, dying in exile on St. Helena, Napoleon allegedly spoke these final words. He said, "France, the army, head of the army, Josephine." Those were Napoleon's final words. Josephine Bonaparte remains one of history's most fascinating figures. She survived revolution, she escaped execution, became Empress, influenced art, fashion, and gardening, and she captured the heart of one of history's greatest military leaders. Yet she remains something of an enigma. An enigma is someone or something mysterious and difficult to understand. Perhaps that mystery explains why people continue discussing Josephine more than 2 centuries after her death. So thank you for listening today. This was the story of Josephine Bonaparte. I'll see you next time. Until then, bye-bye for now.